Is the Shroud of Turin a photograph of Jesus' resurrection? I asked a historical Jesus scholar who's written some books on the Shroud to answer that question for us. But before I show his response, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to the topic. The Shroud of Turin is a rectangular piece of linen cloth, roughly 14.5 feet by 3.5 feet, which many people believe to be the burial shroud of Jesus. There's a faint sepia-colored image of a man's body on the shroud, the front of a man and the back of a man. The cloth would have been spread out. The man would have been laid on half the cloth, and then the other half would have been folded over him. That's why there are two images, the front view and the rear view, that look like they're connected at the head. You can see some weird discolorations on pictures of the shroud. Those aren't part of the image, they're damage from a fire. But the image isn't terribly impressive. You might not even notice it if you weren't paying attention. It just looks like a cloth with some discoloration in the shape of a man. However, in 1898, an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia took the first photograph of the shroud. And later, when he was examining the negative, he saw that the negative looked like a photograph of a man. In other words, it's the shroud that's the negative. So when you look at a negative of the negative, it looks like a picture of a man. A team of researchers examined the shroud in the 1970s. They thought they were going to expose it as a forgery, but most of them became convinced that the shroud is an authentic burial cloth. This led to a surge in interest in the shroud. Then, in 1988, 3 different laboratories radiocarbon dated the shroud, and they concluded that the cloth dates to between 1260 and 1390 AD, more than 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. Since then, there have been repeated challenges to the reliability of the carbon dating, including, more recently, a different dating method that supposedly shows that the shroud is much older than the radiocarbon dating suggested. And the debate continues. But I asked Dr. Gary Habermas, who's written 2 books on the shroud, whether he thinks it's a photograph of Jesus' resurrection. Let's watch his response, and then I'll share my thoughts.
Years ago, not long after I finished my PhD, where I did my dissertation on the resurrection of Jesus, that was 1976. Very short time after that, the news started breaking about the Shroud of Turin. In fact, in 1978 was going to be the most famous investigation of the shroud, 2 years after I finished my dissertation. In fact, just about the same time of the year. 2 years later, 2 years and a couple months. And I decided to call a couple of the guys to see if I could get some firsthand information. So I called one of the 2 biggest named scientists, from professors from the Air Force Academy in various areas of the sciences, to ask. And they had signed a letter saying that they wouldn't talk about this until the results came out. So he was really leery to talk to me on the phone. And he said, "You sound like a reporter." I said, "I'm not a reporter. I'm a guy who just did his PhD, and I'm trying to do research here." "Well, you sound like a reporter." "Okay, well, that's because I'm answering questions." He goes, "Listen, I answered a few of your questions. Let me tell you somebody who will talk." And he gave me the name of a 4th guy. This started as a carpool with 4 guys, professors at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And they would go together in a carpool. Well, the guy I was interviewing was one of the guys in the carpool, and he said, "Let me give you the name of our editor," because he's used to talking to people or asking questions. And it was another guy from the carpool. His name was Ken Stevenson. The first night I called Ken, we talked for like 3 hours, and I didn't even know him from Adam. And at the end of that 3-hour conversation, Ken said to me, "So, you just finished your dissertation on the resurrection, right?" "Yeah." "You seem to know a fair amount about the shroud." "Well, Ken, I'm talking to you because there's a lot more I need to know." "Hey," this is Ken talking, "you want to do a book together?" First phone call. And so I said, well, Ken, I've got a lot of notes. I've already got a lot of it done, but yeah, let's do it together. So he and I did 2 books together, one in 1981 after the investigation and one in 1990 after the carbon-14. And in that first phone call, it's really interesting because I kept asking things about this scientific test, this scientific test, this scientific test. I had 3 hours of talking. And there were times in the tape when I got to the resurrection questions. Ken, could this possibly be radiation from a dead body? Could you be talking about a quasi-photograph here? And you could still hear this on my tape because he gave me permission to tape the call. And he would do this 2 or 3 times. He goes, turn your tape recorder off. I turned the tape recorder off, and he starts telling me about resurrection. I said, okay, Ken, turn the recorder back on. Good enough. Turn it back on. Back to science, back to science, back to science. Hey, Ken, on that radio, on the x-ray thing, can I ask you a question about whether that's a photograph of the resurrection? Turn your tape recorder off. Tape recorder off. More. So that was our very first call. Now, it's a long time later. This was 76, 77 when Ken and I talked. And it's a long time from them. I mean, it's like almost 50 years from that point. But the major view has not really changed. Critics hate it, and critics will go out of their way to say, I faked it, I've done this. A bunch of bull. That's like people living in their parents' basement saying, I'm a scholar, and I'm 17, and I've been to school, but I don't think Jesus lived. Well, the guys who are saying, I put paint on a cloth and I can prove you can, yeah, they submit it, and that flunks every test because it's not the same data that's on the shroud. Let me start by saying you can take any scientific machine or testing procedure we have today, and to this day, 50 years later, you cannot duplicate the shroud with accurate chemistry and physics. That's one mystery. You can't duplicate it. In fact, one of the main guys in the shroud, who I started calling these guys around for our book, one of the guys, a Yale professor, said to me, the problem is the physics contradicts the chemistry and the chemistry contradicts the physics. You're getting different results, but that's just the data. Something's going on here that's very strange. And so I go, okay, thanks for that. And I'd kind of store this stuff in my mind and go on. Well, the evidence for whether the shroud is the photograph of Jesus, which, by the way, a 1978 book by a journalist, but I think he's had a degree in history from Oxford, Ian Wilson. Way back in 78, if I remember the date, Wilson ended his book by saying the shroud could be a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus, a year before they did the investigation. So today they're saying almost the exact same things. There have been a lot of tests in a bunch of laboratories in scientific areas of universities arguing that the image on the cloth is at least two kinds of radiation. Now, here are the facts. We have hundreds of burial garments in existence. And these burial garments, they have 2 different kinds of marks on them: decomposition and blood. I guess the blood would be decomposition too, but maybe the blood came before the guy died. Who knows? Blood and decomposition. Hundreds of burial garments in European museums, and they're put away in the basement, and you can get them. The shroud has an image on it. No other ancient burial garment has a body image. And because the man in the shroud was buried this way, so that if you opened up, the cloth is attached in the middle. If you open it up, the bottoms of the feet and the tops of the feet are going to be in opposite ends. The back of the head and the face are going to be right at the beginning. And you have the chest down to the toes and the back of the head down to the heels. That's how the shroud looks. And no other cloth has an image on it. So we're starting to put a few things together here. You can't duplicate it even today. No other body images from hundreds of cloths. There's no paint, dye, powder, or foreign substance in the image area that can account for the image. Yeah, there's a lot of foreign substance. People are painting it. There's specks of paint that flew on it. There's insect parts. There's pollen. There's things on the shroud, but notice my words. There's no foreign substance on the shroud that could account for the image. A speck of paint here doesn't say the whole thing was paint, because when you look down here, there's no paint. In fact, there was really no paint, pigment, dye on the shroud to speak of at all. So that's another mystery. There's some more mysteries. One is called non-directionality. When we fake something, you start doing this. Think about coloring. You get tired. That's directionality. The shroud happened like this. In fact, we have a photograph in one of our books of directionality on the shroud. It looks like you took a lampshade off a lamp and photographed a bulb, where you can't see the bulb, you just see that's directionality. There's no directionality on the shroud. The shroud image is superficial. Okay, now what's superficial mean? Take a thread, you blow it up under a microscope, the thread is big. The thread might be made up of 200 fibrils, and the image on the shroud is only one fibril deep. Now, what do we know in chemistry and physics where something doesn't go to the back of a dry powder application? You're going to get some residue. A superficial image, very difficult to explain. Non-directional, very hard to explain. But here are probably the two most difficult things to explain on the shroud. It was noticed in the late 70s that photos of the shroud are three-dimensional. Now, here's why three-dimensional is interesting. There are no true three-dimensional photos here. They were invented by the Voyager space shot to get a space to Jupiter shot or a space to Saturn shot. It's a distance thing. But on the shroud, the man's buried like this with his hands in front, and he's stretched out. He's dead. One reason is his head is frozen like this. He's in a state of rigor mortis, his postmortem blood flow, separation of blood and serum. Nobody would question the man in the shroud is not dead. He's dead. State of rigor mortis, kind of hard to fake. So he's like this, and he's dead. His head's frozen forward. Oh, by the way, the knee is popped up like this. That's rigor mortis. It's gone back into its situation on the cross. This guy's been crucified. He's got major wounds, 2 in the wrists, 2 in the feet, and a big side wound right here that's just short of 2 inches across. Blood and water, by the way. Blood and water from that opening. Okay, so you've got this image, no other images, superficiality, non-directionality, but they put it in a machine and the image is 3D. What does that mean? Well, when the body's like this and you put the top one over them like this, that means the cloth touches the forehead, the nose, and the chin. It doesn't touch the ears. It touches my hands on top of my chest, but it doesn't touch my rib cage. It's on top of the knee here, but what about the knee that's down below it? You drape the cloth over it. What about this? The interesting thing what 3D shows is the whole image is there where the body didn't touch the cloth. So now the blood is a contact stain. The blood is there because the cloth was on the wounds. The image is not a contact image. It got there by something else. And today the leading theory is that 2 different kinds of radiation cause the image on the shroud. Now, just as much as we call a photograph a color photograph that someone can show you or you have on your phone, but we also call a photograph, if you have a broken arm and you go get an x-ray, you can say, yeah, they showed me the photo and yeah, it's broken. So, I mean, radiation is a kind of photo too. It's of an actual image. And so that's where you get this, the image on the cloth could be a photograph. Now, is the man Jesus? I mean, just a few years after his death, thousands of Jews are crucified in Jerusalem. What about somebody else? Well, there's some issues there. How come we don't have any, why don't we have any body images on the other hundreds of burial cloths that we have? Why only this one? Okay, another one. He's got something pressed down on his scalp that's made wounds all the way through his scalp. Why do you put something like thorns, I won't even say crown, that's a little bit prejudiced, I can just see the thorn holes. Why would you put that on a criminal? Oh, because they thought he was claiming to be the Messiah. Now you're cheating. If they crucified him in Jerusalem, there's nobody there who thinks he's the Messiah that they're putting up there and putting a crown of thorns on. So why this guy? Why does he have, things that were done to Jesus were not normal crucifixion procedure. You might, for example, argue, by the way, Josephus argues that even people capital punishment were given individual burials because the Jews valued the body. But you might argue that they would throw crucified bodies in the trash heap, in the burning, smoldering trash heap in Jerusalem. Why was Jesus buried individually in a beautiful cloth in a rich man's tomb? Well, how do you know it was a rich man's tomb? Well, there's not dirt all over the thing. He was in an atmosphere where, you know, he's he's buried in a tomb. That's what you have when the cloth is in such good shape. He wasn't thrown on the ground and decomposed. I mean, the cloth decomposed. So, and you go, oh, well, that's sort of like Jesus. Yes, but not like the 70 people in Jerusalem. So it looks like it's narrowing down to Jesus. But how sure am I? Do I think it's the burial garment of Jesus? And second question, is it the resurrection? I teasingly, when people ask me that, I'll teasingly say, yeah, it depends on what side of the bed I got up on this morning. If it's sunny out and I'm going to go fishing, it's a nice day, man, the shroud's 90%. If it's a dreary day and I'm not, I feel a little bit down today, it's probably 70. I mean, I really do. I reassess and I have different percentages at different times. I think there's a good argument that the shroud is Jesus's. You go, well, why do you leave a question mark? Because I have to leave room for the fact, if you want to be scientific or inductive, you have to leave evidence for the fact that somebody might be able to fake it, or somebody might find evidence of a crucifixion victim in 70 AD who they put a crown of thorns on for a criminal, or buried in an individual tomb. I think for the most part, though, the shroud looks like an image. Now, the latest data, part of this 3D, it's widely believed that you can see the teeth on the shroud. Not because the lip has been ripped, but you can see the lip, you can see the teeth through the skin. You can see teeth. Now, if you're seeing teeth with a mouth that's shut, something had to come out. Now, we used to say in our early lectures, we don't know if the radiation will come down this way or if it came out this way. But if this is teeth, as one doctor said to me when I was giving said to me when I was giving this lecture on the shroud, I show my slides, they go, no, it's right there. You see that teeth? Yeah, it had to come out from the inside. The x-ray had to come out from the inside because it brought the teeth out on the cloth, but you can also see the bones in the back of the hand. They think you can see a backbone through the front, but especially the fingers. The fingers look very, very long because you're looking all the way up into the hand. So there are several places that look like the radiation came out from the inside. It's looking more and more like, this man's dead. So the moment would have to be captured, if it were Jesus, it'd have to be captured when he's dead, as he is starting to rise at precisely that moment. Otherwise, you'd say, hey, man, that dude's alive. Well, yeah, he's alive because he's coming alive. No, I mean he didn't die on the cross. So you're in this catch-22. He's dead, but something looks like it's coming out of him. So I usually list the shroud as enough of an evidence that it demands an answer. I don't compare it to my minimal facts argument, where I use the lowest common denominator data and say that on the lowest data that critics will admit there's still a resurrection. I think that's by far the strongest argument for the resurrection. But because I use that minimal facts as the biggie and parts of it as biggies, James, the empty tomb, Paul, that doesn't mean the shroud doesn't belong up there. So sometimes I throw it in debates. I did co-authored 2 books with Ken. And just recently, I'll end with this. Just recently, the carbon-14 has been exploded because they've disproven the 88 carbon-14. They don't have a date for what it is, but they have discovered, and it's been published in an Oxford journal. Interestingly enough, if I get the story correctly, one of the guys whose name's on the 88 carbon-14 argument that said it was medieval is the editor of the journal that published the new piece that said the 88 carbon-14 is all wet. And I can give you the argument for how the carbon-14 has been destroyed. But right now we have all the pro evidence for the shroud, and the only con evidence was the 88 carbon-14. Now it's destroyed. So the way is open here to move ahead and say the shroud could really be the real thing, and it might be a photographic, empirical piece of data for the resurrection.
So, Dr. Habermas says his confidence that the shroud is authentic fluctuates between 70% and 90%. My confidence that the shroud is authentic generally hovers between 20% and 30%. If I watch an awesome presentation on the shroud by an expert in the field who shows me a bunch of epic pictures of various details, I might temporarily get to 50-50, But then I'll eventually fall back to maybe it's authentic, but I'm going to need to see how some of these ongoing debates turn out. The main issues for me are these. On the one hand, radiocarbon dating is pretty reliable. It's not perfect, but it's pretty reliable. I know there are responses and claims about contamination, but the three labs dated the shroud to between 1260 and 1390, and that lines up really well with how far back we can trace the shroud. The documented history of the shroud, meaning our earliest records, where we know they're talking about the Shroud of Turin, go back to the 1300s. There are sources mentioning a burial cloth of Jesus before that, but we don't know if they're referring to the Shroud of Turin. So we can trace the shroud back to the 1300s, and that's when the 1988 carbon dating says it was made. When I see different lines of evidence converging, it's pretty strong in my mind. On the other hand, this is a very, very strange image. If it's a forgery, it's the most amazing forgery in history. I mean, how would someone in the 1300s anticipate that someone more than 5 centuries later would have this thing called a camera, and that if you take a photograph of the shroud and you look at the negative, you'll suddenly see a very clear picture of a man's body, front and back? Someone in the 1300s couldn't have anticipated that, so it would have to be an accident. But that image is some accident. So there are people who believe that the shroud is a forgery. There are other people who think the shroud isn't authentic, but it's not a forgery. They think someone may have made it for a Christian play in a church, and then it got stored, and someone else found it later and thought it was the actual burial cloth of Jesus. Either way, it's pretty amazing that someone accidentally made what amounts to an enormous photographic negative of Jesus in the 1300s. There are lots of other interesting features of the shroud. Dr. Habermas mentioned a number of them. Another interesting detail is that the wounds on the head of the image on the shroud line up pretty well with the bloodstains on a cloth called the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is believed by some to be a cloth that was wrapped around Jesus' head after he died. And the Sudarium can definitely be traced back to the 6th century. So it would be another huge coincidence if some guy making the shroud in the 1300s not only made a photographic negative, but also got the wounds to match the bloodstains on a completely different cloth in a completely different location. Then there are the alternative dating methods. One recent study suggests that the shroud is much older than the 3 labs concluded in 1988. What does that mean? Does that mean I should proclaim this study to be the new proof that the shroud is authentic? No, because there are going to be responses to the new dating, and I'll see how those responses go. But what do you think about the shroud? Do you think it's real? Do you think it's a photograph of Jesus' resurrection? Do you think it's fake? Let me know in the comments section.